This next question, let's start with you, Mr. Perle. You point out that American foreign policy in regards to our NATO allies and Japan was based on the idea of reconstruction and not control. But you fail to take into account the sources of new materials for this reconstruction, namely third world countries, which were directly controlled by the U.S. How then can the United States foreign policy be classified as not being one of controlling other countries when this state of affairs exists?
Look, we have no particular interest, despite the fact that Professor Chomsky continues to assert it and obfuscates when pressed to explain himself, in controlling other countries. He makes it sound as though somehow we benefit from control and take such an extreme view of it that we would even, in his theory, knowingly and deliberately drive a country that might otherwise not be aligned with the Soviet Union into the arms of the Soviet Union. It is a bizarre theory of American policy. The fact is that we have no particular interest in controlling countries beyond the United States. We have an interest in protecting our security. We do not want to see, obviously, Soviet military forces in Latin America. We have an interest in working together with our allies to try to protect and maintain a stable military balance. But the notion of control, his image of the post-war reconstruction of Europe, where we are accused of eliminating the anti-fascist resistance, and the buzzwords are starting to come out as this debate continues, in order to facilitate American investment. Now, of course, you would have most Europeans accusing us of protectionism and trying to protect our own domestic markets for ourselves. The fact is that we are better off, and it's Professor Chomsky's term, with liberal internationalism, that is, with other countries free and independent and democratic, in a position to interact on a free and independent and voluntary basis with the United States. And the notion that we have anything to gain from control is not only not proven historically, it's rubbish. It's a construct that he builds in order to explain, in order to get at what ultimately is his preference for a different international economic order and a different development model.
Mr. Kamala?
Let me stress again that my preferences are beside the point here. The preference of mine that's relevant in this case is permitting freedom and independence and avoiding forceful intervention of great powers in the interests of their own dominant groups. Now, the question was not reconstruction, but not control. Our policy towards Europe, there's enormous documentation on this now, I should say, was reconstruction with control. So we wanted to reconstruct Europe and Japan, but in a particular fashion. We wanted to reconstruct something like the old order, but now not hostile to us, rather integrated into the grand area. Remember, that's not my term, that's the State Department Council of Foreign Relations term that we were trying to develop. Hence, repeatedly, in country after country, we moved to undermine the anti-fascist resistance, which was largely animated by one or another idea of radical democracy or socialism or whatever. Sometimes this was done with extreme violence, as in, say, Greece and South Korea. Other times it was done by subversion, as, say, in France. Sometimes it was done by actual partition of the United States. One of the reasons why the United States was rather favorable to partition of Germany, and indeed may have initiated it, was that it was understood that a unified Germany would have a powerful labor movement. That's discussed carefully, I should say, in internal documents of the period which have now been declassified. We wanted to reconstruct a particular form of social order in the industrial capitalist countries, one in which liberal internationalism would prevail, guaranteeing our dominance given the balance of power at the time. Mr. Perle points out that now we're moving towards a degree of protectionism. That's true, because the relative power no longer guarantees our dominance. And here again I suggest that we look at all of this in a broader historical perspective. It's been absolutely traditional for a couple hundred years since modern industrial capitalism developed. It's been traditional for those who believe they're going to win in the competition to be in favor of free trade. There's even a standard name for this in the scholarly literature. It's called the imperialism of free trade, referring in particular to the British Empire. The British Empire, during the period when Britain was being established as the world's major industrial power, the rape of India and so on, they were not at all in favor of free trade. By the early part of the 19th century, when England became the workplace of the world, the dominant industrial power, it became in favor of free trade on the assumption that its domestic investors and so on would win out in any competition. By about the 1920s, when England was no longer able to compete with Japan, it turned against free trade. In fact, closed off the empire to Japanese penetration. And that's exactly the story that we're reliving. As long as it was assumed that the United States' U.S. interests would effectively win out in any competition, as in fact they did for many decades, we were all in favor of freedom of trade. Now that it's not at all clear that they're going to win out in competition, we naturally turn to some other forms of protectionism, just as we were highly protectionist in the 19th century, when we had to develop our own industrial system by blocking British steel imports. Nothing very surprising about this. Perfectly standard. If we didn't have the documentary record which explains it, we would know it anyhow, just by looking at the historical record. With regard to the Third World, that meant exactly what was stated. It's got to be available for exploitation for the reconstruction of industrial capitalism in the manner in which we want it reconstructed. That's part of the reason for the continual intervention and violence in the Third World, the attacks on democracy, the attacks on freedom, the slaughters, whether it's Indonesia in 1965 or Central America today, the repeated interventions in places like Guatemala. That's the reason for it. It's the way to maintain a certain kind of world order, a world order in which U.S.-based interests will in fact prosper. That's been the